Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next installment of the Gateway Spotlight series. I'm your host, Brooke Roberts. And today's episode, we are exploring the next generation of experiential learning, experiential education. And over the past few years, the rise of virtual exchange and remote internships has changed the way we think about global experiences and what does that actually mean. So on today's episode of The Spotlight, we're exploring the next generation of experiential learning. And I am joined by Martin Tillman and John Wells, two guys who know a thing or 50 about workforce readiness and experiential learning. Martin Tillman, or Marty, as we all love to call him, is president of Global Career Compass and international consulting practice. His work focuses on the impact of education abroad on student career development and employability. John Wells has over 30 years of experience working in education abroad. He has worked with governments, universities, and providers to grow education and abroad enrollments. As a Gateway affiliate, he is currently helping Next Step to expand their partnerships in the United States. Which brings me to our sponsor of today's episode. We are proudly sponsored by Next Step, nextstepconnections.com. They are offering on-site virtual internships and study tours throughout Asia. With over 4,000 students supported since its founding in 2008, Next Step is truly a global provider with participants from Europe, Asia, Australia, and the US. More than 300 host companies throughout Asia means that Next Step can customize study tours and internships to meet your students' academic and professional needs. If you'd like to learn more about Next Step, just go to nextstepconnections.com. That's nextstepconnections.com. All right, let's get into today's episode, guys. Are you guys ready? Welcome.
Hi.
Thank you, Brooke.
Great. Well, I don't want to dwell on this too long because we only have about 30 minutes to dive into this topic, but I was nerding out yesterday in my open doors books from the last couple of years. And it looks like international internships or experiential learning has increased over the past 2 years, even with a global pandemic. And when we say experiential learning, we're talking about internships, but also research, service learning, and other types of engagement on the ground, which I thought was really, really interesting that the number is going up despite obviously us having a dramatic drop in just study abroad participation in general, which leads me to believe that internship demand is on the rise, and virtual internships are also on the rise. And so I want to start a conversation with you, John, and talk about how virtual internships and remote internships have sort of come on the scene over the past few years. They were on the scene even before the pandemic, but they really brought them to light in the last couple of years. How do you think this evolution of remote and virtual internships is good for students?
Thanks, Brooke. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. They were on the scene before the pandemic, but certainly offices were forced to increase their offerings there to give students still an experience. I think when you look at it and think about what are the traditional barriers to being able to go abroad, to spending a semester, to travel, we're talking about cost. We're talking about the time commitment required. And one of the nice things about virtual internships is it reduces costs. It changes that time commitment. Yes, you still spend the hours working with an organization, but the ability to match it with your courses during the semester or your need to take care of family or your other responsibilities. Really, there's an opportunity to lower some of the significant barriers to participation in programs abroad through virtual internships.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Marty, anything to add?
No, I agree with what John just said. I think that there's definitely a lot of data, a lot of evidence clearly that campuses have definitely picked up on this opportunity once everyone accepted and went, sort of got beyond the denial that the pandemic could really be as bad as it was. And after people shut down and after it was clear that the principal places in the world where any sort of international experience happened, like in Europe, like in London, were no longer options. Then I think there was a really a relatively quick turnaround, at least for those campuses, I must say, who were resourced enough, who had the capacity to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one thing I think is also really valuable about this next evolution of internships abroad or internships, international internships, is that I think it's setting students up for that workforce readiness. I know you talk a lot about, Marty, because now I think the skill set of being able to engage virtually and to manage one's own time and to engage purely in a virtual environment in a workplace setting, I think is a necessary skill that is going to be just assumed that you have. And so obviously we need to prepare students to gain those skills, because I think it's going to be like knowing how to use Microsoft Office. Like, it's just assumed everybody knows how to use it now. It's not a special skill set anymore. It's sort of like just something everybody has. And I think this ability to navigate that virtual environment and collaboration strategies and technology, et cetera, is going to be just like Microsoft Office in the future. That's my prediction.
And I think you're spot on with that. I mean, I've been in the business for many, many decades. And what I think has happened is that prior to the pandemic, in conjunction with the Black Lives Matter movement, the whole issue of inclusion and emphasis on diversity on campuses amongst the professional associations, certainly within NAFSA and how it goes about doing its business. The notion that was out there and everybody struggled with, which was, how do we diversify the opportunity to have international experience, how to be career ready. And that readiness was really available only to a minority of undergrads in the United States since World War II. And it was predominantly women, and it was predominantly white women. And so whatever I was writing about this issue of linking employability outcomes to having this kind of unique experience, I was caught up in this awareness that, wait a minute, this issue of employability and the benefits were really accruing to a small number of undergrads. And so the benefit in the last few years has been a reawakening of this opportunity for every undergraduate. That is the opportunity to be virtual, but be abroad at the same time.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's also interesting though, too. I think especially if we put the lens purely on internships abroad, I think the idea of unpaid internships, but also pay to play internships also feeds into that idea of only the wealthy few who have the capital to be able to be unpaid or to pay for an internship experience. It is also, limits the pool of students who can do that. So I think you bring up a really good point that yes, this does, I think, open the playing field for a lot of students, but at the same time, it also has a fee with it. And so, there's also still a barrier to entry that we still have to figure out how we're going to lower those barriers for students. And I think, we were talking before we started recording. Sorry, guys, you missed it behind the scenes. We were having a great chat about how these experiences are great if done well. And so I would love, Marty, because you've worked with a lot of organizations to help roll out not just virtual internships, but internship programs in general. What are the key elements that an institution should look for or to incorporate into a virtual internship or any kind of internship program that's going to make it a well-designed, well-run program so the students get the outcomes we're aiming for?
Well, the most important thing here, Brooke, I think, and John, I want you to certainly jump in on this. We talked about it, but the most important thing is for a campus to be clear about its expected learning outcomes. It's not about just the administration of a new type of learning experience, understanding how to use the technology, et cetera, in an instrumental way. It's like with anything, the institution has to acknowledge what it wants students to gain from the virtual experience. What are the academic outcomes? What are the intrinsic personal skill sets that they're interested in having students gain through the virtual internship experience. It's not about, I don't want to get now into, it's not about what's different or how to try to catch up to what's live, since we're only doing it virtual. Put that aside. It's just the idea of planning up front, being clear, and it's important to be clear with not just what's happening to students on this end, but on the other side with the employers, with the businesses, with the nonprofits, whoever are the partners. They have to be buying in to clear, articulated learning goals at the beginning of the development of the experience. And the other thing I want to feed into here is what I have focused on a great deal, and that is the concept of career integration. The breaking down of silos on campus between, say, a career office and the international staff. It's not common for students to be set up to visit both sides on the student affairs staff. And the international education staff may not know clearly what is going on when students are in a career service office. So I have delivered a lot of workshops about this, and it's clear to me that there is a need for cross-training on campuses. That is, people from different departments, including faculty, should sit down in the same room and go through this, run through what the expectations are for their students, right? In advance of the offering of the experience, I think. So that's what's meant by career integration. Students who have that kind of preparation up front also are going to be able to talk about it to their families and explain more clearly why this is of value, how it might help them when they get into their senior year and are really more actively doing a job search, if you will.
Yeah, I think that Martin, you make an excellent point with the integration of and working closely together between that education abroad office and career office. If we think about what those of us in education abroad have always focused on, good programming always required and encouraged student reflection and students to think about that learning that was taking place. That's also the case with virtual programming. So working with that career office to figure out how do we structure an intentional reflection part. Let's face it, we're not ever going to have, these programs aren't going to have a virtual water cooler. We've all tried to do Zoom happy hours and variety of things early on, I think during the pandemic, to, in many cases, pretty awkward responses. Maybe some worked, but I certainly was on a few where just never quite flew. So how do you structure that? I don't think we can completely replace the water cooler talk, but certainly intentional programming around having students discussing what's going on. The opportunity to maybe, when the programming is right, to have that be global. In the case of Next Step, for example, it's not just US students doing these internships, it's students all around the world all of a sudden. That's a really powerful component then to some of the programming.
Yeah. With the Global Pro Institute, when we had our internship program running, we structured it because in a very specific way, because it was just an 8-week internship, and we knew we wanted students to milk every single moment out of that time that they were spending. And so we focused it on basically 4 areas, and we created a map with each student. And so I will say that, like, sometimes with helping students create their own kind of syllabus, if you will, learning outcomes for their specific career goals, academic goals, personal, professional goals, whatever. And so we focused on core areas. So one was understanding the organization and mapping out activities they could do in order to understand the organization and how it functions. The second was to understand the industry or the field that they were in. So us, it was understanding international education and how that organization fits within that larger umbrella. The third was the student's own skill set, that knowledge, skills, experience element. What skills do they need to develop and identify, and start identifying ways they can develop that, experiences that they want to have while in the internship, and then maybe further down the line, et cetera, and those connections they need to make. And then the fourth, so I say, in this context, would be that global framework, right? How do I, as an individual, as a professional, emerging professional, fit into this sort of larger global perspective? How does the organization, how does what we do as an industry have that global impact? And so I think every institution or every program that you're designing, if you can come up with a broader framework, and then as a student comes in, they're an accounting major, they're economics major, whatever, they can start filling in some of those gaps based on their specific situation. And that's, I found that for virtual internships, having a much more sort of almost a checkbox based structure was really important, because you couldn't rely on the serendipity of them meeting someone in the hallway and having a random lunch with somebody who becomes their mentor. It's like, no, you need to reach out to 3 people to have 3 informational interviews so you can get the lunch. Like, we had to make it that intentional, because we couldn't rely on the serendipity or the magic. So that's just a little example of a framework that we created to make this more tangible for students of like, what do I need to do?
Yeah, I would just like to say, Brooke, that's excellent. There is a document hidden somewhere in the NAFSA online box. If you Google my name maybe and career action plan,
Okay.
it was something that I and a woman who's no longer working in the field of career services developed and put out. I know it's still available, but we attempted to do just that. It's a very highly structured step-by-step process for students to be helpful in terms of pushing them forward step-by-step towards integrating their interest in having an education abroad experience, assessing their own needs, the development of skills they want, who do they talk to, what are the right questions to ask, etc. So it's
Love
something
that.
out there.
If somebody watching has a minute, wants to do a little Google reconnaissance for us and add that link to the chat, we love you for doing that. That's great. One of the elements that I'd love to chat with you guys about is, this has come up when I've been at conferences chatting with people about virtual anything really, but especially specifically, we'll talk about virtual internships. I kind of alluded to it in our last question, but I call it the magic, right? The magic of just being on the ground and the smells and the tastes and the things you can't plan for. Like, we can structure a program to the nth degree and still something crazy will happen. We just know that's how it works when you're moving people around the globe. How do we replace that? And John, you allude to this, that you've seen it done not well. But how do we replace the magic of a global experience in a virtual world? And I'd love, and maybe you can speak a little bit to how Next Steps program design really helps facilitate that. Because it might need to be more structured, and maybe it feels less magical, but it does create magical moments.
Yeah, I think it does need to be a lot more structured. To be honest with you, I'm not sure we do replace the magic. I'm not sure that's an achievable goal. But I think we need to look at the balance overall and say, if this allows more access, maybe we're okay without a little bit of that magic involved then. If we can still structure the learning, the reflection, the discussion amongst participants about what's going on, how it pertains, and give them the kind of skill sets, which I think you highlighted earlier, are really going to be key in the workplace in the future, that we have all had to learn very, very quickly, to a new way of communicating, a new way of working as teams than we were used to. So structuring and getting students to think about and discuss that outside of their workplaces, I think, is essential. Is it going to equate to the magic and the great stories? And I think about my own study abroad experience eons ago, and the best stories were the serendipitous train rides, for example. We're not going to be able to do that. But access and availability of programming and quality programming and thoughtful programming, I think, balances that out.
Well, I would agree with you. I think that I'm sorry, Marty, just one second. I think I agree with you, but I think that that magic can happen even in a virtual discussion room. And because I think it's not just about the smells and the tastes, although those are lovely, and the random trains you miss around the world. We all have those lovely stories, but I think that there's also just power. And I think what I'm really interested to hear more about with Next Step is that dynamic virtual classroom of a student from Singapore and a student from Japan and a student from, Kansas. I'll just used to call myself out. And then being able to sort of see like, oh, like they're interpreting this workplace dynamic that we're experiencing through our internship differently than I'm interpreting. I wonder why. I think that's still magical.
Martin, did you want to?
Oh, well, I think this is an important issue for you guys to directly address. I was just going to say, I think we should remember, as we started earlier, to talk about the way that more students, a broader swath of undergrads, will benefit from virtual experience. These are often students who have never left their state, their city, their home community. So having the opportunity to just virtually interact with individuals who are exceptionally different from everyone else they've to date had the opportunity to talk with, by itself can be a kind of magic for sure, right? I mean, we can't presume how we interpret what magic means. It means very different things for
I opened up a can of words with this word. I see.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, and no, you're absolutely right, Brooke. That and maybe we're all defining magic differently here. Maybe that's the key to it.
Was this the thing that you just can't quite describe, but when you see it and experience it? Yeah.
To have facilitators, to have coaches involved with the programmings around these discussions, when you have students from the US and from Asia and from Europe together discussing about what's gone on in their workplace, about the way they interacted, about the expectations, is really powerful when somebody's there to help guide the students kind of through that process. And that's an essential bit. And I think all the good programs have someone in that role. So that's one essential piece of it, that it needs to be guided and kind of curated a little bit more for them through the process.
Well, I'm going to go rogue. I warned you. I might go rogue with a rogue question here, but that kind of brings up another point of this, especially for administrators who are listening and watching. And if you are, please say hello in the chat. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. But I'm curious, do you think virtual internships versus in-person internships on the ground, do you think one is more labor intensive from an administrative point of view than the other? Because you did just describe that maybe the virtual might need a little bit more finessing and fine tuning and follow up and guidance than the in-person. Or did we always need that with the in-person? We just didn't do it.
I think there's a lot of truth to the very last comment you made.
Tell us more about that, Marty.
No, I mean, I think there's there's a cost in when you're setting up a virtual experience, like I sort of alluded to earlier. You really need to carefully vet your partner, and you're going to have to be there. I don't think that's something you ideally should do virtually, but it may be of necessity to, in terms of who are the students talking to, who will supervise. What's the material you have them see and read? Do they fully understand the context in which students are expected to go through the experience, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just that's something that you might have. You could assume would be everybody would be on the same page when everybody is more live, and when you have the benefit of a lengthy period of interaction, building trust with the partners abroad or domestically in some other area of the country, where that interaction exists. There's a past history in relationship to the institution, et cetera, et cetera. But the virtual programs that have been coming up are new, relatively speaking, for many, very new. And so therefore you can't make assumptions. You have to spend time making sure everybody is on the same page. And I think that gets to the point of being purposeful in the design, structuring, being intentional about everyone's connection to the goals of the program that are set forth, et cetera, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I would just say for anyone who still may be going, what does it mean to be intentional? What does it mean to be purposeful? This isn't a great opportunity for you to give yourself permission to not be an expert at career readiness. Like, you're an international educator. Maybe that's just not your area, and a great opportunity for you to go make a friend in career services and ask them what they already do with students when they're preparing them for either getting a job or getting internships, because they've been doing this. This is what they're paid to do. So partner with them, because they could probably give you a framework to layer on top of a virtual or even international in-person internships that you could use that framework as well, or at least that litmus test, if you will, when vetting partners. Because I don't expect all of us to be, masters of everything that we do. Lean on your partners in your institution who already know that stuff.
I would just, the caveat there, and I have seen this for myself, when career advisors are hired, top of the list of required qualifications may or may not be prior international experience. It's not necessary for a career, someone interested in the field of career services, to have studied abroad. That's just not there, right? But you would expect that as definitely a high on the list, if obviously you're going for a job at a broad office, right? And so when a student visits that career office, you can't presume the person they're talking to has a personal context in which to respond to the queries that they're being asked about the meaning of the experience. How should I put that on my resume? How do I articulate the benefits? If the person they're talking to, hasn't done anything like that in their own personal life, it can be a little bit difficult. And so,
absolutely. I completely agree. I was thinking more along the lines of designing the internship program. Yeah. But you're right. Yeah. Like if they haven't done it, they may not even think it's that valuable. And they're like, why would you put that on a resume? I totally
maybe they never had an internship. Of any sort. It's not, I wouldn't be shocked about that. Okay.
John, any final thoughts as we close this up?
I think going back to that point of, is it more time consuming to do the virtual internships? Does it require more input? I think Martin kind of hit on it, and I would stress this as well. I think a good internship, be it domestic or international, still requires those kind of things. Really well thought out, planned internships. It's just been a little bit easier historically when the student was going down the street to intern someplace, to not quite worry about it as much. The ability to come back and stop by the office and ask questions was a little bit easier. So we do need to be back to that magic word of intentional. Mm-hmm. We need to be a bit more intentional in the programs. You really need to reach out and find out, how is that structured? How are you going to make sure that's intentional as part of the process?
Mm-hmm. What I found when we did our through GPI in this process, what I found really interesting is we do a weekly coaching call throughout the program as well. And so when they come, the students or the participants would talk about, well, I'm still confused about this. And it was sort of that, again, work readiness of like understanding how to ask the questions that they needed, especially in a virtual environment. They didn't want to be like constantly pinging them with a question every 10 minutes, and then how to just even navigate their questions or concerns in that environment where you don't have the ability to just see them in the hallway and be like, oh, I had a quick question for you. Even those small, communication norms, if you will, get kind of displaced in a virtual learning. And so I think you're right, like having those moments where students have the ability to, a structured moment where they can get clarity on how to navigate the situation from a career side of, like, how do you operate in a professional setting, but also maybe the intercultural dynamics that might be at play if they don't know how to navigate either. I had a friend who did an internship in the Netherlands, and she was working with this company, that, it was just very normal. Everybody brought their lunch and everybody ate together. And she didn't know, like, is it expected of me? Do I need to be invited? Like, what is the dynamic? And it was something she struggled with for several weeks. It's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. And that's just a little thing. Like, I don't know, apparently it's a thing in the Netherlands that everybody does. So any final thoughts, any words of encouragement you guys have for anyone out there who are still hesitant to dive into the virtual internship game?
Well, I'd certainly want to encourage everybody who's on the call to stick with working in the field. These are tough times. I know there's been a lot of transitions and switches in everyone's career plans. I just want to encourage everybody to hopefully be able to stay with the field that we're in. It's a wonderful field, and there are going to be new opportunities with new technology. And certainly, I think an expansion of virtual learning going forward. And you can make a valuable contribution to your institution by being there.
And my encouragement would really be kind of, don't put yourself in a box and saying a program needs to be this way. Take a step back and think about, what do we really want the students to achieve? What are our outcomes here? And is there a different way to get there? Mm-hmm. And I think when you start doing that, you just realize the potential that exists, be it virtual, be it in person, be it hybrid, so many different ways to approach this. And I think we have a frame for thinking about that now that maybe we weren't as willing to 4 years, 3 years, even 2 years ago.
Yes, John, well said, and a wonderful way to close out. Do not be afraid to also delete. If there's stuff you've been doing that just isn't serving the outcomes you're trying to get for students, it's okay, delete it and replace it with something more meaningful that's actually going to help you get there. Thank you both so much for being a part of this conversation. I know that we could probably talk for another 7 hours riffing on this. So thank you both. I have Martin Tillman and John Wells here as our guests today. And I want to thank our sponsors, Next Step. You can go to nextstepconnection.com to learn more about them. And thank you everyone for being here live. Thank you, fellas. It's great chatting with you.
Thanks, Brooke.
Bye.